I grew up in a small town in the Midlands, living a fairly urban lifestyle during my childhood and teenage years. One day, I stumbled across one of those reality survival shows, the kind where they put a soap star through intense survival challenges. It made me wonder if I had what it took to survive in a disaster or post-apocalyptic world, or if I'd end up struggling and starving, like some lost city dweller unable to find a grocery store to buy a ridiculously overpriced sandwich. I tried to get some of my friends to join me on an adventure, but they thought I was nuts. When I first suggested camping, they all imagined staying at a neat campsite with a pub nearby. But when I explained I was aiming for something a bit more extreme, they all bailed. After doing some research, I learned about solo camping and knew it was a thing people did. It became a challenge for me to take the plunge and head out alone to see if I was capable of it. Turns out I was tougher than I thought. While I didn't exactly thrive in the wilderness during that first solo trip, I didn't die, and I actually had a great time. I'm not going to bore you with cliches about reconnecting with nature or living like our ancestors. Don't get me wrong, that stuff's true. But for me, it was more about how it made all the small annoyances of modern life seem insignificant. Standing in line at a crowded bar, waiting for 2 pints and some snacks. At least you're indoors, warm and dry. Pizza delivery running late. At least you're waiting for hot food that isn't canned. It gave me some serious perspective, and I could see how beneficial it was for my mental well-being. Plus, it was awesome to practice some real survival skills. When I got back, my friends assumed I'd never want to do it again. But to their surprise, I told them I was eager to go out again. Over the next couple of years, I did 3 or 4 solo trips, each to a different forest. Eventually, I set my sights on a place in southern Scotland called Galloway Forest Park. It was just a few hours' drive over the border, a very accessible spot. But what stood out was that it housed some of the most remote wilderness areas in all of the UK. Picture a vast ring of land, 15 to 20 miles across in some parts, with wilderness in the center. Once you're deep in, it's a 2-day trek through harsh terrain to find any real road or signs of civilization. When I first read about it, it seemed like the perfect spot to really test myself. I booked a few days off work, scraped together some funds, and got on a train. I'm kidding, but just barely. I set off for Galloway on a damp September morning, drove to a small town called Newton Stewart, and spent the night at a backpacker's hostel, Glenmalloch Lodge. I paid extra for them to look after my car while I was out in the wild. The lodge staff thought I was crazy, mostly because I was going out there alone. They reminded me that I'd be out of mobile phone range, with only a ranger station near a place called Bunhill. Everywhere else was pure wilderness. If I got hurt, finding someone to help would be nearly impossible. They weren't shy about telling me how foolish my plan was, but the risk was part of the appeal for me. I was confident in my skills, and the idea of navigating the wild excited me. After a good night's rest, I packed up and headed into the forest for 4 nights of hiking and camping in one of the most remote areas of the UK. The excitement I used to feel before every wild camping trip was still there, but this time it was mixed with a bit of fear. Being out there alone brings a sense of vulnerability. The UK doesn't have dangerous predators like some of the wilderness in America, but still, there's a certain eerie feeling about being isolated. After dark, the quiet can be unsettling. On the second day, while walking toward a spot called Silver Flow, I began to wonder just how isolated I really was. It was mid-September, so not exactly peak hiking season, and by the afternoon, I realized I was a full day's walk away from the nearest person. That kind of isolation was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. It felt like freedom. No one around, no one to tell me what to do. It was almost like a post-apocalyptic feeling, being the last person on Earth, with nothing but the wild landscape surrounding me. By the end of the second day, I needed to find a place to camp. The area was mostly open, grassy land, with a few small boulders scattered about. There wasn't a tree in sight, which made things tricky since I needed trees for shelter and firewood. I pulled out my map and saw that I'd have to climb a massive ridge to get to the nearest trees. The climb looked brutal, but I didn't have many options. I started the ascent, exhausted but determined, knowing I couldn't afford to be caught out in the open after dark. When I reached the top of the ridge, I was so tired that I had to stop and rest, carrying everything I needed to survive. Food, water, shelter, tools had worn me out. Even though I'd packed light, My shoulders were aching. I sat on the hillside and looked out over the land. It was stark, rocky, and treeless, stretching for miles in every direction. It felt like I was on top of the world, with no sign of life in sight. The views were breathtaking, and the lack of roads or even villages was surreal. In England, even in the most remote areas, you'll still find winding lanes, cottages, and the occasional pub. But here in Scotland, the wilderness felt untouched, like stepping back in time. After a quick rest, I made my way over the ridge and toward the trees, about half a mile away. When I arrived, I set up camp, just a waterproof poncho stretched between two tree trunks, and got to work on a fire and cooking dinner. It took a while, but by the time I was finished eating, I only had about half an hour of daylight left. I used the time to gather firewood, make a cup of cocoa, and then prepare for bed. The last thing I did before lying down was place my mug of cocoa near the fire to keep it warm. I wasn't too concerned if it got cold overnight. There was only a little left. I set it carefully on the stones around the fire, then climbed into my sleeping bag, ready for rest. The second night of camping is always better than the first. On the first night, you're still adjusting to sleeping outside. No matter how tired you are, your subconscious mind isn't used to the strange surroundings, and it keeps you from getting that deep sleep. But by the second night, you've acclimated a bit, and the exhaustion from the hike ensures you sleep more soundly. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in weeks. As I put my boots on, I remembered the cocoa I'd left by the fire. When I looked over at the campfire, it had gone out, but my mug was nowhere near it. I had one of those "wait, did I forget to move it?" moments. But then I spotted the cup balanced on a nearby log, perfectly placed. I honestly thought I hadn't left it there, but it hit me. Someone else had moved it, and that realization turned everything upside down. I quickly grabbed my knife and began scanning the area. I was on high alert now. My Victorinox folding knife was all I had between me and total defenselessness. I unfolded the blade and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Then, second-guessing myself, I walked over to the cup, still on the log. But when I got close enough to inspect it, I noticed something inside. The remaining cocoa was gone, and in its place was a long piece of grass, tied into little knots. It was clear that someone had been here, carefully tying knots in the grass, maybe while sitting on that log watching me sleep. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Some people might think it's a harmless prank, but the problem wasn't the cup being moved, it was the potential danger. The person could have done anything. They could have harmed me, stolen my stuff, or worse. If someone could sneak up on me while I was asleep, what would stop them from doing it again, or escalating? The idea of someone watching me, knowing they had all the time in the world to act, was terrifying. In the wilderness, when you're out there alone, it's not just about surviving the environment. The potential dangers from other people, unpredictable and unknown, are just as real. And in a place like this, with no one around for miles, things could escalate quickly. My name is Rachel, and I'm from a small town in Idaho. I'm about to share a terrifying experience from a solo camping trip I took last fall. It may sound foolish, a young woman camping alone in an area known for strange disappearances, but I had a firearm with me, so I felt a little more secure. Though I knew it wasn't perfect protection, just having it made me feel safer. In October, I decided to visit the Pine Ridge area. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from the noise of daily life, and I hoped the peaceful views would help me relax. I chose Pine Ridge because it had moderate trails, not too hard, and I didn't mind that it was a popular spot. Being around other campers made me feel less alone, and I figured if anything went wrong, help wouldn't be too far away. I hiked about 4 or 5 miles down the trail before setting up camp, making sure to pick a spot that wasn't visible from the main path for some privacy. By the time I had my tent set up and my campfire going, I was exhausted. I made some quick dinner and decided to rest for the night. It was around 9 p.m. when I crawled into my sleeping bag, using my backpack and a rolled-up sweater as a pillow. I must have fallen asleep almost immediately because the next thing I knew, I was dreaming. My sister and I were in the back seat of my dad's car, driving somewhere. She was teasing me about some boy I liked, and I kept asking my dad to tell her to stop, but he stayed silent. Then, in my dream, I heard this loud sound, a zipper being pulled. I looked around in the car, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but then I realized what was happening. It was the zipper on my tent, and I was wide awake. The sudden shift from the dream to full awareness was jarring. I went from the warmth of the back seat to the cold, dark silence of my tent. My only thought was, get your gun. It wasn't much, a small 9mm handgun I'd practiced with, but it was something I could use if I needed it. Still, I'd never thought I'd actually be in a situation where I'd need it. And my instructor had warned me about adrenaline, how it can make everything feel more difficult. Even though I'd practiced, it was tough to get the gun ready, and the zipper kept going. I could hear the sound getting closer, and my mind raced. I finally managed to pull the gun from its holster. I probably sounded terrified as I yelled out, "Get away from my tent if you don't want to get hurt." The zipper stopped, but the silence that followed made me realize the person hadn't left. I repeated myself, saying that I had a gun and would start shooting if I didn't hear them leave in 5 seconds. I heard footsteps then. The person stood, took a few steps back, and started walking away. I thought they were running, but no. The footsteps got softer, like they were distancing themselves, and then, finally, silence. I didn't know if they were still out there, waiting, or if they'd really gone. I lay there, gun ready, for what felt like forever. Finally, I managed to move. I had some weak cell service, so I called 911. The dispatcher said they could alert the sheriff's office, but the forest rangers would be able to get to me faster. They'd arrive in about 20 minutes, but that was the longest wait I've ever experienced. Every rustle or crackle in the night had me on edge, listening for more footsteps. When the rangers arrived, I told them what happened. They looked around the area but didn't find anyone. However, they found the person's trail leading into the woods, which meant they had to have been hiding nearby. It didn't make me feel any safer. The rangers offered to give me a ride to my car, and I gladly accepted. I wasn't about to stay another night there. That was the first time anything like that had ever happened to me, and for the record, nothing like it has happened again. But at the time, I was shaken, and not just because of the scare. I don't know if anyone can understand unless they've been in a situation where they've had to contemplate defending themselves with lethal force. I've trained, but in that moment, it was all too real. I'd always thought that pulling a gun would scare someone off like in the movies, but the reality is so much different. My instructor had always said, if you pull your gun, be ready to use it. That's not something you can just ignore. If you hesitate, you risk losing control of the situation entirely. Looking back, I'm glad nothing worse happened, but I'll never forget that moment. The intense fear and the gut-wrenching thought of possibly taking someone's life is not something you can prepare for, no matter how much training you have. It's something you can never unthink. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. My friends, Alex, Jake, and I had planned it for a while. Nothing extravagant, just a simple night in the woods. We decided to head to a remote spot in the middle of Kentucky, somewhere far off in the backwoods where the trees were dense and the roads were nothing but dirt. It was just us, a tent, some beers, and a campfire. Basic, really, the kind of camping we had done countless times in our younger years. I thought it would be a good time, and it was until the next morning. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting. We quickly set up camp, pitched the tent, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. The night was quiet, with only the sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. We spent the evening drinking, laughing, and enjoying the peace and quiet of being away from the noise of the city. Everything was fine until I woke up the next morning to find the fire had burned down to embers and the sky was overcast. The first light of morning was beginning to creep in. Alex and Jake were still asleep in the tent, so I crawled out to stretch my legs. I decided to get some coffee started, so I went over to my truck to grab the pot from the back. That's when I saw it. There was an animal skin stretched out across the hood of my truck. It wasn't thrown carelessly. It was carefully laid out, almost like someone had taken their time arranging it. The fur was completely removed, and the underside was raw and pink, with blood dripping down the windshield. It was thick and dark, already beginning to dry at the edges. I couldn't tell what kind of animal it was. Maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. The head was gone, and the legs had been hacked off, jagged, like someone had used a dull blade. The smell hit me first, a sour, meaty stench that clung to the air. I froze, just staring at the gruesome sight, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I scanned the area, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me, but the woods were eerily still. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just me and whatever that thing was on my truck. I kicked the tent to wake up Alex and Jake. They stumbled out, still groggy, and their faces drained when they saw the skin. We didn't need to say anything. It was clear something was terribly wrong. We packed up camp quickly, throwing everything into the truck without even folding it properly. I grabbed a stick and pushed the skin off the truck. It hit the ground with a wet thud, and I didn't look back at it again. We piled into the truck, and I floored it, kicking up dust as we sped down the dirt road. The whole way back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing us, but there was nothing. Still, that feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. We didn't talk much during the drive. Alex just stared out the window, and Jake kept fidgeting with his fingers, picking at his nails. I focused on the road, trying to keep my mind empty and avoid whatever was behind us. When we finally got back to town, we quickly went our separate ways. I went home, hosed down the blood from my truck, and watched as the red water swirled down the driveway. It didn't seem real, but my gut felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling. Later that day, I started asking around. A guy named Mr. Walker at the local gas station gave me a strange look when I mentioned it. He said he'd heard stories of people finding skinned animals left on their vehicles or porches in the deep woods. He said it had been happening off and on for years, but no one knew who was doing it. People thought it was some kind of warning, a message for outsiders or people who didn't belong. Mr. Walker told me about something that had happened to him years ago, back in the 80s when he camped too far out. He woke up to find a skinned rabbit on his cooler, and he never went back to that spot again. I didn't sleep much that night, and I couldn't stop thinking about that animal skin, how it was stretched out so carefully. Eventually, I went online to look for more information. I found posts from people all over the place. Stories about skinned animals left in remote areas, always the same pattern. Some people said it was just hunters gone crazy or pranksters, but others believed it was something older, something connected to the land. One guy even swore he saw figures moving in the trees after it happened to him, but he didn't stick around long enough to find out more. The more I read, the worse it got. People talked about feeling watched after they got home, hearing strange noises, as if whatever had done it wasn't finished with them. I tried to convince myself it was just a sick joke or some twisted prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I don't know who did it or why. Maybe we camped in the wrong spot, or maybe it was random, but one thing was for sure. I know it wasn't some animal that skinned that creature and left it on my truck. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will. Alex and Jake feel the same way. We don't really talk about it much, but it hangs over us, like an unspoken thing. I still drive that truck, but every time I look at the hood, I see that skin. I lock the doors now, and I don't know if I'll ever feel at ease again. All I know is I'm never going back to those deep woods. My girlfriend once told me about an incident from her early 20s, but since she's not much of a storyteller and didn't want to write it out herself, I got her permission to share it. She grew up in Rochester, New York, and went to college at Columbia. One October, with a few free days, she decided to drive back to Rochester to go glamping with some friends. She and 4 other friends, all aged 19 or 20, headed out to a campsite that had cabins, fire pits, and picnic tables. As they started unpacking, they noticed they had neighbors, another group of 4 guys around the same age. They struck up a conversation, and one of the guys asked if they'd like to share a few beers once the sun went down. After everyone had eaten, the plan was set. When the evening came, they all gathered at the girls' picnic table to kick off the party. As the night went on, things got more and more intense, but everyone was still having a good time, getting to know each other better. Then, one of the guys disappeared into his cabin and returned with a gun. He said it belonged to his dad and started waving it around, acting like a complete idiot. Everyone told him to put it away because messing with a gun while drunk was beyond a bad idea. He dismissed their warnings, saying the gun wasn't loaded, and to prove it, he aimed it at the sky and pulled the trigger 2 or 3 times. No shots went off, but still, the group wasn't thrilled about the whole situation. They insisted he go back inside and stow the gun safely, suggesting that he get some sleep since he was clearly too drunk and acting out of character. The guy took offense to this, and after checking the first 2 chambers, he put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Here's where most people get it right when they guess what happened next. The 3rd chamber, the one he pulled the trigger on, was loaded. Nobody knows how it ended up that way, whether he loaded it and forgot someone else did or he didn't check it properly. But whatever the cause, the guy shot himself right in front of them all. The scene turned into chaos. My girlfriend said the screams and crying were the things that stood out the most. She and one of the other girls tried to help, giving what little medical attention they could and guiding 911 to the cabins. My girlfriend said that the first aid given was mostly a formality. They both knew the guy was beyond saving, but they had to do something to calm everyone else down before the situation spiraled even further. It took about 30 minutes for EMS and the police to arrive, and by then, the mood was already grim. One of the guys was practically frozen, too shocked to speak, while one of the girls cried nonstop, unable to get the image out of her head. It was like she couldn't stop reliving the event every time she calmed down a little. For weeks afterward, my girlfriend and her friends showed signs of what doctors called acute stress disorder, which, from what I understand, is kind of like the early stages of PTSD. It has the same symptoms, but if it lasts long enough, it turns into PTSD. Thankfully, 3 out of the 4 girls, including my girlfriend, started to heal after a few days or weeks. But the girl who couldn't stop crying was prescribed medication for PTSD for years. To this day, she says that night changed everything for her. It made her very anti-gun, and I can see how it has shaped her view on the topic. It's had an effect on my own perspective, too. I'm still a supporter of the Second Amendment and a gun owner, but I do think there's a real gray area when it comes to firearm ownership. Guns in the hands of responsible, sensible people have always been a good thing, but the problem arises when they're in the hands of young, drunk idiots. Something that should make me feel safe can, in the wrong hands, turn into something truly terrifying. We're going back nearly 2 decades for this one. A trip down memory lane. Around Halloween in 2006, I went camping with my then boyfriend, who is now my ex, and 3 of his friends. Initially, I was hesitant because I'd be the only woman in a group of 4 guys. I'd met my boyfriend's friends before, but I had this feeling it would be awkward with just me and 4 guys camping for 3 nights. On top of that, I wasn't sure I could trust them to pick a decent spot or actually do anything beyond sitting around the campfire, grilling meat, and drinking beer. Well, I was totally wrong on both counts. There was plenty of grilling and sitting around the fire, sure, but the campsite they picked was beautiful, better than I could have imagined. 2 of his friends were really into hiking and camping, so they didn't just pick any random spot. They chose a stunning location. I'm not exaggerating here. The area was breathtaking. There was a waterfall just a short hike away, providing clean water for drinking and washing, and there were several trails around, easy, medium, or difficult, depending on how we felt the next day. It really was the best of both worlds. The guys were polite and fun, and most importantly, they respected my need for privacy. They didn't make any awkward comments about what my boyfriend and I might do in our sleeping bags, which, let's be honest, is something nobody wants to think about outdoors. Since it was late October, there were hardly any other campers, which suited me just fine. I was able to use the waterfall to freshen up after a day of hiking. The trails were ours to enjoy without the usual crowd, and no one drank too much the night before, so we were all ready to get moving the next morning. After another round of grilling and a few drinks, we went to bed, and I told my boyfriend, "Thanks for bringing me along. This has been unexpectedly amazing." He laughed, probably because he'd been telling me not to worry the whole time, and hearing me say that was probably very satisfying for him. I meant it, though. It had been wonderful. That is, until the next morning, when everything took a turn for the worse. There are a few things I need to explain first, so what happened next makes more sense. The night before, After we'd finished setting up, my boyfriend asked me to put the cooler and stereo in his truck while he took care of the fire and gathered up the trash. I did as he asked and then put the truck keys in the front pocket of his backpack, which was positioned at the far side of the tent, away from the door. Our sleeping arrangements were such that my boyfriend was closest to the door, and he had his firearm with him just in case anything strange happened. We heard nothing that night. The next morning, we woke up feeling fine. After making sure everyone was awake, we unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The campsite, which had been perfectly neat the night before, was now in complete chaos. The campfire pit had been destroyed, the rocks we used to contain it scattered across the ground. Every door of my boyfriend's truck was open. The stereo had been smashed against a tree, and the cooler had been opened, emptied, and thrown around. Raw meat was lying everywhere. We all sat there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The peace and quiet we'd enjoyed was gone. Everything felt wrong. As we got dressed and left the tents, we tried to figure out how this could have happened without anyone hearing the noise. What started as a fearful discussion quickly escalated into accusations. My ex accused me of not locking the truck the night before, which made me furious. I clearly remembered locking it, and I swore I'd done so. I could even recall putting the keys into his backpack, which was far from the tent door. He went over to grab his bag, and when he opened it, the keys weren't there. That's when things got worse. He started accusing me of being careless, demanding an apology. As soon as I realized the keys weren't in the bag, I felt sick, like I was losing my grip on reality. I stumbled outside, retracing my steps, and eventually found the keys near one of the open truck doors. I could barely speak, but my boyfriend seemed to realize something wasn't right. He went quiet and said he just wanted to leave. After apologizing to his friends, we packed up the remains of our stuff and left in a hurry. On the ride home, I was a mess. I kept asking my boyfriend to believe me that I had locked the truck, and I felt like I was losing my mind. He stayed silent for a long time until I started crying, at which point he said he believed me. But that didn't help with the bigger question of what had happened the night before. I kept asking him what he thought occurred, since he had more camping experience than I did. He just kept saying he didn't know. We eventually pulled into a diner parking lot to take a break and discuss things. I don't care if some of you don't believe me, but I swear this is the truth. My boyfriend finally spoke up. He said that the night before he'd had a strange dream, not a full nightmare, but enough to wake him up in a panic. He told me that when he woke up, he didn't hear anything strange outside, so he just went back to sleep. He dismissed the dream as nothing more than a side effect of drinking and hiking. He didn't think much about it until I started freaking out about the missing keys. Then, after a pause, he told me what had happened in his dream. He said he'd woken up to see someone standing over him, like crouching near his sleeping bag. The person's face was strange, like it was made of ski mask material, not just wearing one. At first, he was terrified, but when he realized it was a dream, he forced himself to wake up. He had a laugh about it and went back to sleep, but when I asked him what he thought it had to do with anything, he just didn't answer. I felt frustrated and told him to just get to the point, but he went quiet again, only getting us coffee before we left. We drove home without talking much. After I got home, I took a shower and tried to rest, still hoping we'd discuss what happened. But later that day, when I called him, he told me he didn't want to talk about it. He'd met up with his friends, and they decided it was best to just move on from it. He didn't want to go to the police or park rangers. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My ex was always careful with his truck, and I thought for sure he'd want to file a report for insurance purposes. But no. At the time, I had a theory. I believed my ex was the one who had trashed the campsite. I didn't know if he'd blacked out or done something in the middle of the night, but I think he was scared of acknowledging what might have happened. He didn't want to confront the possibility that he could have smashed his own stereo or done something else in his sleep. It seemed too frightening to him. He didn't want anyone, especially his friends, thinking he was out of control. We broke up less than a year later, and while that camping trip wasn't the only reason, it definitely played a part. One of the last things I told him was that if he ever needed help, I'd be there for him. I don't think he ever did seek help, and I think that night remains something he's learned to ignore. This is just a theory, but it makes me think that I might be closer to the truth than I realize, because to my knowledge, he never went camping again. In the summer of 1980, the idea of going on a camping trip was brought up in a conversation. Mark, a close friend from high school, had been complaining about his job for weeks. He had been stuck working a dull desk job at an insurance firm, and our other friend, Joey, and I weren't doing much better. I was bouncing from one temporary job to another, while Joey was stuck in a warehouse moving boxes for minimum wage. We were all craving a break from the daily grind, anything to escape the routine of work and hanging out. But we didn't have the money to fly to the Bahamas, and we couldn't all get time off for an extended road trip. So we decided to go camping. After discussing it, we chose the Lincoln National Forest as our destination. It was just an hour's drive north of Albuquerque, making it close enough for a quick trip, but large and remote enough to feel like we were escaping into the wild. The forest spanned over 2,500 acres of pine trees, and we knew from a previous trip that it could take hours to cross. It had been a couple of years since we had been there on a short day trip, so we thought 3 nights in the early autumn would be perfect, before the weather turned too cold and rainy. As the date approached, we started planning more seriously, pooling our resources to keep costs down. My old, rusty sedan barely passed inspection, but it was good enough for the trip. Mark managed to dig out his dad's old 2-person tent from the garage. It wasn't in perfect shape, but it worked, even with a few patched up holes. Since it only fit 2 people, Joey brought a small 1-person tent he had bought on sale at a military surplus store. We split the rest of the gear: sleeping bags, a cooler, some cooking supplies, and Joey added a fishing rod while I grabbed a couple of tarps in case it rained. Mark had gotten a map of the park, one of those foldable pamphlets from the Welcome Center, and with that, we felt ready. I remember the drive being a lot of fun. We left on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, as we played our favorite songs on the car stereo. About an hour later, we reached the park just as dusk was settling in. The small gravel lot by the entrance had only one other car parked, and after putting a few bucks into the self-service kiosk, we picked a campsite near a spot called Maple Pond. It was a flat area surrounded by tall trees, with a fire ring already in place. The ground was covered in pine needles, and through the trees, we could see the shimmering water of the pond just 50 yards away, glowing in the light of the setting sun. It was beautiful. We unloaded the car and made our way to the site, setting up camp. That first night went off without a hitch. Mark got a fire going using a lighter and some crumpled newspaper he had brought, and we roasted hot dogs on sticks and heated up beans in an old pot I had found in my mom's basement. The food wasn't gourmet, but out there it tasted better than I expected. When we were done with the dogs, we cracked open some beers and sat on a log we had dragged over to the fire. I leaned forward, staring at the flames, feeling the stress melt away. I thought to myself, this is exactly what I needed. The next day, we decided to do some exploring, so we picked a 3-mile trail that looped around the pond and led up to an overlook. The path was narrow, and the woods were alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and animals darting through the underbrush. The view from the top was amazing, with the forest stretching out beneath the morning sun. We sat there for a while, passing around a bag of trail mix, marveling at how peaceful everything was. Even though the forest felt wild and untamed, we felt safe. But that feeling didn't last. Sunday started out the same. We hiked again, this time on a longer trail, and returned to camp in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied. Mark took a nap in his tent while I gathered more wood. After eating, as the sun set, we decided to get some sleep early since we were exhausted from the day's hike. With Joey's tent just a dark shape nearby, I zipped up our tent and got into my sleeping bag. Mark was already snoring next to me. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of an animal, and I soon drifted off. But I woke up feeling cold. The air in the tent felt damp and wrong. I fumbled for my flashlight, turned it on, and saw that the flap was unzipped. I sat up and looked around. Mark's sleeping bag was empty, and his boots were gone, though his jacket was still there, crumpled in the corner of the tent. I checked my watch. It was just after 4:30 a.m. I figured he had gone to the bathroom and would be back any moment. I lay back down and waited, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no whistling, just silence. A minute passed, and I sat up again, turning the flashlight back on. I shuffled to the flap and peeked outside. It was pitch black, the darkness swallowing up the beam of my flashlight as I scanned for any sign of Mark. I moved the light this way and that, but there was no trace of him. I felt silly, wondering if I was just overreacting. Maybe he really just went to pee, I thought. I figured I'd walk a few feet, see him coming back, and then laugh at myself for getting worked up over nothing. But something kept nagging at me. What if something's wrong? I put on my boots, grabbed my jacket, and stepped out of the tent. The forest was silent, and I started walking in a circle, shining the light into the trees. I called out Mark's name, low at first, not wanting to wake Joey unless it was necessary. But the forest was empty, and the shadows swallowed up the light. I called Mark's name again, louder this time, and that's when I heard rustling in Joey's tent. He unzipped it, looking up at me with sleepy eyes, his hair a mess. He asked what was going on. I explained that I thought Mark was missing, and after a brief back and forth, Joey agreed to help. He put on his boots and jacket, and we started searching, calling out Mark's name. We widened our circle, scanning the woods, but there was still no sign of him. Joey suggested that maybe Mark had been sleepwalking. He'd done it as a kid. I wasn't convinced, but we kept searching. We moved deeper into the woods, and the ground started to slope down, roots twisting beneath our feet. The forest felt larger, more impenetrable, and my feet were soaked. My hands shook in the cold, and the flashlight's beam seemed weaker the further we went. After about an hour, we stumbled across Mark's hat, snagged on a bush. It was the faded blue one he had been wearing all trip. My heart sank. We kept moving, and 50 feet later, we found his socks. One discarded, then the other, tossed aside like he'd just peeled them off and left them behind. Then came his jeans, crumpled in the dirt, his t-shirt, and finally his boxers, scattered along a deliberate path that seemed to stretch over 60 yards. Joey asked if I'd seen Mark drinking, but we had all drunk the beer on the first night. Still, I had no idea if Mark had secretly brought something stronger. But even if he had, he wasn't the type to act like this. Something didn't add up. We kept walking, calling for Mark, but there was still no sign of him. Then we found it. Lying on the ground, face up, was Mark's body. His head was missing. The blood around the stump was still fresh, and the cut was clean, straight. The rest of his body was untouched, its skin pale and unnaturally white in the light of our flashlights. I froze, unable to speak or move. It looked fake, like a movie prop. I couldn't believe it was real. Joey didn't want to accept it either, and he kept calling Mark's name, frantic and desperate, pacing around the body. But it was clear now. That was Mark. I eventually found the words to say it. "Joey, it's him. It's Mark." Joey shook his head, still in denial. He wouldn't look at the body, his voice breaking as he denied it. I had to say it again, louder this time, and when he finally stopped denying it, he broke down, sobbing. I felt my legs go weak, but I couldn't sit. I went over to Joey and tried to comfort him as best I could. "We have to do something, man. I know it's messed up, but we need to act." Once Joey calmed down, we made our way back to camp as fast as we could, running when the ground allowed it. Time didn't matter anymore. Our friend was gone. When we reached my car, we drove until we hit the small town of Anderson. We turned toward the ranger station and pulled in, frantic and tearful. The rangers gave us some coffee and listened to our story. Joey did most of the talking, his voice a mess, but I helped him when he stumbled. They asked us questions we couldn't answer, and finally, we just begged them to come with us. By the time we returned to the campsite, the sun was rising. Everything was as we had left it. We walked with a ranger to where we had found Mark's body, and when he saw it, his jaw. Early last year, I moved into a new home well outside any major town. My job had shifted to remote work, so there was no need for me to stay in a crowded and pricey urban area anymore. For the first couple of months, I truly enjoyed the new place, especially the peace that came from being far away from neighbors. Then one ordinary Wednesday afternoon, someone knocked on my door. It surprised me because it was the first time anyone had come up to my front step since I'd moved in. I got up and opened the door to find a tall man in his late 40s standing there. "How can I help you?" I asked, trying to appear friendly, assuming he must live somewhere nearby. But right away, instead of replying, he leaned to the side to peer past me into my house, like he was trying to see if someone else was inside. His odd behavior immediately put me on edge. I moved to block the entrance with my body and held the door partly closed, saying nothing. Without another word, he turned around and began walking back down my driveway. I watched him the entire way until he reached the road. There, he got into a car that had been parked along the shoulder and drove off. It was by far the strangest interaction I'd had with a stranger in my adult life. I didn't know how to process it. That evening, I stayed home and made dinner just in case the man returned. I thought about calling the police, but I figured it would sound ridiculous to report someone just for looking into my house and walking away. At around 9 p.m., I turned on the TV to unwind before bed. While I was watching from the couch, I suddenly heard muffled voices outside. I turned the volume all the way down and listened closely. I could make out at least 2 different people talking, somewhere out in the backyard. I rushed to the rear window and pulled up the blinds. In the distance, under the dim moonlight, I saw 2 figures walking through my yard. One was carrying a long object, maybe a crowbar or something similar, but I couldn't make out the other person very well. They moved between the trees until they reached the far side of my house. I darted to the side window to keep eyes on them, but they had vanished and their voices had stopped. I walked around checking every window, but couldn't spot them anywhere. Then came a sudden, loud bang at my front door. The sound made my chest tighten. I tiptoed toward the door and looked through the peephole. A man was standing there wearing dark clothes and a cap pulled low over his eyes. It looked like one of the same men I'd just seen outside. But where was the second? "What do you want?" I shouted, figuring they already knew I was inside and hoping to scare them off. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the side of my house, then looked back at the door. The silence was far more unsettling than if he'd shouted something. I backed away, headed for my phone in the living room, and was about to call the police when I heard a smashing noise. Then another. Then another. I looked down the hallway and saw someone swinging a shovel at the glass of my back door. We made eye contact for a second before he turned and bolted. My hands were shaking. I was torn between calling the police or finding a place to hide. But before I could decide, I heard another window being struck repeatedly on the side of the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while the window kept taking hits. Just as the operator answered, everything suddenly stopped. The silence stretched on until a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. That's when I heard shouting and scuffling outside. The officers had found someone near my house. To my disbelief, it was the same man who had knocked on my door earlier that day. He refused to say anything about who the second man was or what they were doing. He just kept denying everything, even though there were marks and dents all over the doors and window frames. Even weeks later, he never explained what he and the other man were trying to do. Nothing ever came of it. The mystery of who the second person was and why they chose my house still creeps me out. Why were they so determined to break in? What was the man at my door even doing there earlier that day? I ended up moving out a few months later. To this day, I still wonder if they were after me specifically, or if I just happened to be the wrong person at the wrong time. Listing gone wrong. Not long after I moved, I decided to sell an ergonomic desk chair I barely used anymore. It wasn't damaged or anything. I just didn't need it and figured I'd make a bit of cash. A few days after listing it online, I got a message from someone interested. We had a short call. He sounded like a normal guy and even agreed to my asking price. We decided to meet in the parking lot of a Kroger store on a Friday afternoon. I picked that spot so the exchange would be in public. As planned, I called him on my way there and arrived right on time. He said he drove a silver Toyota Corolla, which didn't help much since that's one of the most common cars out there. He knew what car I drove too, so I figured he'd come find me. But the minutes ticked by. He didn't show. I I sent a text and eventually gave him a call, but there was no answer. I stayed in the parking lot for nearly an hour before giving up and heading home. At first, I was just frustrated that he wasted my time. But on my way back, I noticed a vehicle behind me that seemed to be following a little too closely. It made me uneasy, but when I turned onto my street, the car kept going straight. That eased my nerves a bit. Once inside, I tossed my phone and keys on the counter and walked back out to grab the chair from my trunk. As I made my way down the driveway, a vehicle pulled up along the road and parked right outside my house. It looked a lot like the car that had been behind me earlier. This one was a faded red sedan, maybe 15 or 20 years old, with visible rust around the wheel wells. I quickly got the chair inside, closed the garage, and locked all the doors. Peeking through the blinds, I watched as the car just sat there with the engine still running. I checked my phone again. Still no reply from the man. That's when the worry really kicked in. About a minute later, I heard a car door open and shut. I looked out again and saw someone standing next to the car, wearing dark clothing, facing my house like he was trying to study it. That was all I needed to see. I closed the blinds and immediately called 911, telling them I thought someone had followed me home from the store. They said officers were on their way. After hanging up, I peeked out again. The car was still there, but the man was gone. My heart started to pound. I walked to every window in the house, trying to see where he went. When I got to the back door, I found him. He was standing inside my fenced yard, staring up at the house from just a few feet away. He wasn't doing anything, but that was almost worse. After a moment, he began walking toward the side of the house. I rushed to the front of the house again to see if he was leaving, but I never saw him return to the car. I checked every window one more time, but couldn't find him. When the police finally arrived, they found the car still parked out front, but there was no sign of the man. Even stranger, the car was completely empty. No papers, no phone, no belongings, no fingerprints. It had been bought at a salvage auction years ago, but that was the earliest trace they could find of it. The officers seemed just as puzzled as I was. Whoever the man was, he hadn't tried to break in and left without a trace. But we were nearly certain it had been the same guy from the ad. He used a burner email and account to arrange the sale and had probably followed me from the parking lot to my home. It's been a few months since all that happened, but I still feel uneasy. Why would he inspect my house from all sides if he wasn't planning to return? What exactly did he want? And what would have happened if I hadn't locked the doors in time? This happened about 3 years back. I had rented a small place during a short trip to visit my cousin. He lives roughly 6 hours away from me, so we don't meet often. Since his apartment only has one bedroom, I needed somewhere else to stay when I came to visit. The house I booked was only a couple of blocks from his place, and it cost about the same as a nearby motel, so it was a pretty easy decision. I got into the city early that morning and met up with my cousin for lunch. Afterward, I picked up some groceries and headed to the rental around 5 in the evening. The house was pretty basic, just a couch, a television, and a bed. For the price, I wasn't expecting anything fancy. I stayed up until around 9 p.m. before heading to bed. It had been a full day, and I was really hoping to get some solid sleep. I ended up lying there longer than I wanted to, tossing around for about an hour before I finally dozed off. When I opened my eyes again, the room was completely dark. I could tell it was deep into the night, though I didn't check the clock. That's when I heard it. Faint footsteps coming down the hallway. Then a door closed softly. After that, everything was still. It was like my body couldn't move. I just laid there, frozen, staring into the darkness. After about a minute of nothing else happening, I forced myself up and looked down the hallway. At the very end, I could see the front door, and I realized that's what I'd heard shut. But I couldn't tell if someone had left or was still inside. I crept through the other rooms, one by one, not spotting anyone. The only thing that stood out was the front door. It was unlocked. I didn't find any footprints or see anything out of place or stolen. Once I checked all the doors and made sure they were locked, I called the police. They arrived fast, but they didn't do a whole lot. Just told me to keep the doors locked and to reach out to the rental's owner. That was it. No offer to investigate or anything. I ended up staying awake the rest of the night, too nervous to sleep. I called the owner in the morning and told him everything. He apologized and said he'd changed the code for the front door, which made me feel a bit better. I went to meet my cousin after that and spent most of the day out with him. We grabbed dinner and a few drinks, and he dropped me off back at the house around 9 p.m. I sat down on the couch, feeling exhausted, but that unsettled feeling from the night before was still with me. Every time I started to drift off, my head would be filled with worry that whoever had been there might return. Knowing I couldn't go another night without sleep, I decided to check the place again, hoping it would help calm my nerves. I walked through the kitchen and living room, then down the hallway toward the bedroom. I looked in the closet and also checked the bathroom connected to the room. Right as I turned to leave, I heard fast footsteps running down the hallway toward me. I spun around and caught a quick glimpse of a large man rushing in. He slammed the bedroom door shut just before I could get a better look. Then I heard him move off again, heading toward the front of the house. I didn't move. I just stood still and listened. I could hear him going through the living room and kitchen, opening and moving things around. He was in there for probably a couple of minutes before the front door opened and closed again. I called the police right away, and they arrived quickly this time. The owner came over too. The living room and kitchen were a mess. Couch cushions had been tossed, drawers pulled out, and cabinet doors left open with stuff all over the floor. But after going through it more closely, the owner said nothing seemed to be missing. It looked like whoever broke in wasn't there to steal just anything. They were clearly looking for something specific. After that, I packed up and moved into a hotel. I never heard any updates in the following days, and I doubt anything ever came of it. What really haunts me is the thought of that night when I checked every room. Where had that man been hiding? Was he already inside with me, watching me the whole time? And what would have happened if I'd fallen asleep on the couch? When I was 22, I made the mistake of moving out of my parents' house before I could really afford it. I'd actually been planning it for months, spending all my time looking for cheap places, shared rentals, and anything that might help me get out on my own. For some reason, moving out became the only thing I focused on, no matter what. After a few months of looking, I found a listing in a local Facebook group about a room available for rent. It was in a small 2-bedroom home, and the owner was offering the extra room. I messaged the guy, and he replied almost right away. He asked a few simple questions, then sent over what looked like a super long list of rules. Most of it was pretty basic stuff, nothing strange or unreasonable. After I agreed to everything, he said I could come by that same day to check out the room. When I showed up, I was really surprised at how spotless and nice the house looked. It seemed like something out of a catalog, really well decorated and neat. The owner, who told me his name was Derek, seemed a little off though. He looked like he was around 29, but he didn't really match the house at all. He had on a wrinkled, stained t-shirt and just gave off a weird vibe with how he talked. Still, I was so focused on finally moving out that I didn't care much. A week later, I rented a van, packed up my things, and drove them to the house. The second I walked in, I thought I had gone to the wrong address. It looked completely different. Everything was gone. No decorations, no furniture. Just an old couch sitting in the living room. The whole place felt empty and bare. Derek was standing there like nothing was wrong, acting super excited that I was moving in. I asked him what happened to all the furniture and stuff I saw before, but he brushed it off and started carrying my things inside. Even though I felt uneasy, I still moved in. Weeks went by. I barely saw Derek. He was hardly ever home and seemed to work a lot. After about a month, I noticed that he basically stopped coming home altogether. Maybe once a week, I'd hear him get back around 2 or 3 in the morning, stay downstairs for a bit, then leave again. Sometimes he'd be gone for a whole week. A part of me didn't mind since I liked having the house to myself. But another part of me started to get curious. He'd been so eager for me to move in, and now he was almost never around. Then one night, around 2 a.m., after not seeing Derek for several weeks, I woke up to him pounding on my bedroom door and yelling my name. I got up quickly and opened the door. Derek stood there, dripping with sweat and looking furious. He told me sharply not to leave my room, then yanked the door handle out of my hand and slammed it shut. I just stood there, frozen. I listened as he went downstairs. A few moments later, I heard him dragging something heavy across the floor and into the garage. I cracked the door open quietly and peeked out. A thick trail of dirt and mud ran through the kitchen and ended at the garage door. I tried to open it, but somehow it was locked from the other side. At that point, I knew I needed to get out. I ran to my car, drove off, and called the police right away. By the time they got to the house, Derek was gone. The smudges on the floor were completely cleaned up. After a few days of looking into it, the police told me Derek wasn't even the owner. He was actually just renting the place from someone else. That meant I hadn't legally been allowed to move in. All the paperwork he sent me was fake. His name probably wasn't even Derek. And just like that, he vanished. Nobody ever saw him again, not even the people who actually owned the house. I still don't know what he was doing that night, but whatever it was, he didn't want me to see it. He was desperate for me to stay in my room. What I don't get is why he wanted me to live there with him so badly in the first place. Felt like he had something in mind for me, like a plan. I think I was lucky to get away before I ever found out what that plan was. This occurred a few years ago when I was 27. My mother had just passed away, and as the only child, I inherited her house. I had the option of selling it or moving in. I was living in a cramped, run-down apartment at the time, unable to afford much, so after thinking it through, I decided to move into the house. It was already paid off, which would save me a decent amount of money. My plan was to live there for a few years, save up, and eventually buy a place I really wanted. Once my lease ended, I moved across town to the house. It was part of a small community where most of the land had stopped being used for farming and turned into empty fields. My mom's property was the same. The house itself was a rustic barn-style home in the middle of a large field, with only a narrow, overgrown path leading up to it. During my first week there, I spent most of my time cleaning and organizing. One evening, while I was cleaning, I heard a car approaching. I looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck slowly making its way down the overgrown path. It struck me as odd because the only reason someone would be coming down that path was if they were heading to the house. The truck stopped near the end of the path, and I could see a man in the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out many details. He sat there for a while, the headlights shining across the field. Then, after a moment, he did a three-point turn and drove off. I thought maybe he'd gotten the address wrong or was just lost, but it felt a little unsettling to see someone out there so late at night. A few days passed, and by then I had finished most of the cleaning and organizing. One Sunday night, I was staying up late, watching TV and eating a homemade meal when I heard a familiar sound. A car driving toward the house. I looked out again and saw that same truck, this time with all its headlights off. This time, it didn't feel like an accident. I checked my phone and saw that it was almost 1 a.m. Who would be coming out here at this hour? The truck came right up to the house and parked, and then a man stepped out and walked toward the porch. I waited for him to ring the doorbell or knock, but after a minute, he just stood there. I carefully approached the front door and peeked through the peephole. The man was standing directly on the porch, staring at the door. I froze, terrified. He seemed to be thinking about something. Then, without knocking, he turned around and went back to his truck, driving away quickly. I was really shaken up, so I called the police, but they couldn't do much. I went to bed with a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I woke up to what I thought was a knock at the door. A single knock. I rushed to the window, but there was no sign of the truck. I quietly got out of bed and was about to go downstairs to check when I saw that the front door was slightly ajar. I froze. Then, I heard footsteps moving through the hallway below. I quickly hid in the spare bedroom and dialed 911, trying not to make any noise. The footsteps came closer, up the stairs, and into the main bedroom. I could hear things being moved around, like the man was searching for something. I stayed as still as possible, too terrified to speak to the officer on the phone in case he heard me. After a few minutes, I heard the footsteps heading back downstairs, and then the door closed as he left the house. I ran to the back window to see if I could spot him before he got away. It was dark, but I could make out the figure of the same man who had been on my porch earlier. He was walking across the backyard toward the tall grass and eventually disappeared into it. The police came by later and tried to find any evidence, but my description of the man was the only lead. I had no idea what he was looking for, but it seemed clear that he was after something specific. Maybe he knew my mother had something valuable, and after hearing of her death, he came to take it. What terrified me even more was that he must have known I was home, possibly even in the bedroom, and yet he still came in and searched the place. What had he planned to do if I had been there? In the end, I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I sold it a month later because I couldn't shake the fear of him returning. Even now, I check for any reports of break-ins at that address every few months, but nothing has happened since that night. I was 23 back then, living in a tiny one-bedroom rental on the edge of a rundown neighborhood in my town. It was a Friday night, and after getting off work, I got online to play games with a bunch of buddies. The weather was nasty, rain was coming down hard, and with no job or classes to deal with the next day, it felt like the ideal kind of night to stay up late. We were a couple of hours into playing when I suddenly heard a noise that made me pause everything. It sounded like a thud, and it came from upstairs. My first thought was maybe the roof was leaking from the storm, so I went up to take a look. The only spaces on the second floor were the bedroom and a small half-bath. I checked both thoroughly, but there was no water dripping or anything else out of the ordinary. I headed back down and rejoined my friends online. I stayed on for a good while longer, only logging off around 2 a.m. because everyone else had called it a night. I shut off my setup, grabbed a few snacks, and sat on the couch to scroll through some YouTube videos on my phone. Around 10 minutes in, I caught another thump. Again, it came from the upstairs area, but this time it was quieter, almost like it was coming from above the roof instead of inside. I went back up, checking even more carefully than the first time. I looked through the bedroom and the bathroom again, feeling for any cold air or dripping, but nothing seemed to explain the sound. It didn't feel like thunder. It had a deep vibration to it, almost like something striking the structure. After searching for another 10 minutes and still not figuring anything out, I decided to throw on my shoes and step out into the downpour to see if something outside might make sense of it. At first, I didn't spot anything unusual. Then I noticed a thick tree branch near the side of the house. It was solid and big, but even with the storm, it didn't seem to be moving much. The thing was maybe 3 or 4 feet from the wall, so it didn't seem like it could reach the siding, let alone bang against it. But as I stared at it, I saw something else. There was a tiny window mostly hidden behind the branch. It sat higher than my bedroom window, meaning it had to be an attic. I had no idea this place even had an attic. The roof wasn't sharply angled, and there was no sign of a hatch or entry point anywhere I'd noticed before. That window was the first clue I'd seen. Curiosity got the better of me. I went back inside and started looking for some kind of entrance. It took a little time, but eventually I spotted a small panel in the closet ceiling of my room. It blended in almost perfectly with the ceiling, barely visible aside from a faint outline where it opened. I stood on a storage box and pulled it down. A dusty, creaky ladder unfolded from above. Right away, I was hit with a horrible smell, like old garbage or something dead. And just then, I heard that thump again, this time below me. I could tell the attic space wasn't tall, maybe 2 feet at most. It was like a narrow, dark tunnel. I slowly climbed up and looked inside. At the far end, near the tiny window, I could make out a person crouched low on all fours, facing directly toward me. I nearly slipped off the ladder trying to get away from there. I bolted, grabbed my phone, and ran outside into the driveway to call 911. I stood there in the pouring rain, heart pounding, while waiting for them to show up. When the police arrived, they went in and managed to bring the man down. Turned out he was just a homeless guy. He had climbed up the tree, gotten through the attic window, and had been living up there for at least a week without me realizing it. The whole situation was insane. I moved out not long after. Ever since then, no matter where I've lived, the first thing I check is the attic. But what stayed with me more than anything is the image of that man, crouched at the end of the crawl space, his eyes staring back at me, wide, alert, and filled with something that looked like a mix of fear and something else I still can't name. I don't travel often, so this was one of the rare occasions I needed to stay somewhere other than with friends or relatives. The town I was visiting was small, and most of the motels in the area looked pretty rundown. To my surprise, though, I came across a single listing for a house on a site similar to Airbnb. It was my first time booking something like that, but the house looked clean and a lot better than the local lodging options. I put in a request for the dates I needed, and within minutes, it was confirmed. The following week, I made the long drive out. By the time I got to the town, which was about 13 hours from where I live, it was already late. The place looked practically empty compared to what I was used to. All the houses were dark, every shop was shut down, and there wasn't a soul or a vehicle in sight. Sure, it was the middle of the night, so I wasn't expecting much activity, but the total stillness gave me an uneasy feeling, especially since this was my first time seeing the town. The road to the rental house was barely lit, winding through a wooded neighborhood. Eventually, I reached the place. It was one of the only houses with its porch light still on, and I noticed a single light glowing through a window on the second floor. I assumed maybe the last guest had accidentally left it on, so I didn't give it much thought and carried my things up to the door. I had received the key code by email earlier, so I entered it and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. I dropped my bags in the corner and then walked upstairs to switch off the light in the room. It was a guest bedroom, just a bed and a small dresser. I flipped the light off and then made my way to the master bedroom to unpack a bit. I was only planning to stay one night, but I had booked the place for 2 since I'd be in town late the next day. After settling in, I stayed up for about an hour before crawling into bed and trying to fall asleep. Even though I was tired, I couldn't seem to doze off. I laid there with my eyes shut for a while, hoping sleep would come, but I was still wide awake. That's when I heard something. A dull thump echoed through the walls, and I shot up, startled. I stared at the door, heart starting to pick up speed, trying to figure out what it could have been. After a moment of hesitation, I stood up to check it out. I gently opened the bedroom door and looked out into the hallway upstairs. It was pitch dark and still. No more sounds, just the faint groaning of the house shifting in the breeze outside. I closed the door again, quietly, but something felt off. I stood there, listening. Then I began to hear soft, slow creaks coming from the other room, the floorboards gently pressing as though someone was walking across them. I pressed my ear to the door. The creaking moved into the hallway, and then slowly came toward where I was standing. A sick feeling spread through my chest as I realized it wasn't just the house settling. Those were footsteps. They stopped right outside the door. My hand gripped the knob tightly, keeping it steady. I didn't move. Then the handle began to turn. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it right away. They let go for a second. Then, out of nowhere, they yanked the handle and slammed their body into the door. It swung open partway, and I lunged against it with all my weight to hold it shut again. For a second, I saw part of a face in the gap between the door and the frame. Just one eye and part of their mouth, but the expression was something I'll never forget. There was a furious look in their eye, wild and hateful, like they meant to do serious harm. I don't know how, but I managed to shove the door back into place and lock it. The person on the other side twisted the handle again, shouting angrily, then finally stormed off down the stairs and out of the house. I stood there, gasping for breath, barely able to think. My hands were shaking. After a few seconds, I grabbed my phone and dialed the local emergency number. Despite how quiet the town was, a police car showed up not long after. I gave my statement and left the next day. The homeowner kept up with the investigation afterward, but I never checked back to see how it ended. Whoever that was, they weren't just trying to rob the place. That man wanted in that room, and the way he looked at me, it was as if he had some kind of deep hatred, like I had done something to him, even though I had never seen him before. Still messes with my head. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget it. I'll definitely be more cautious about renting houses again. Sights like that just don't feel safe to me anymore. Not after that night. I live on the edge of a medium-sized town in Montana. The main reason I moved out here is because getting a big piece of land isn't as hard or expensive as it is in a lot of other places. My home's pretty small, but it's been good enough for living by myself. This happened about 4 years back in early 2020. It was springtime, and we'd been getting almost non-stop rain for weeks. Nearly every day it poured. It was a Sunday, and I was off work, spending the evening on the couch watching shows and relaxing. Around 6 or maybe closer to 7, I heard an unexpected knock at the front door. I barely noticed it over the noise of the rain hitting the roof and windows. When I opened the door, I was pretty surprised to see a stranger standing there. It wasn't a delivery person or anything like that, just some guy I'd never seen before. My place is out of the way, and no one comes up the long gravel drive unless they have a reason to, so I was immediately uneasy. I asked if he needed something. He looked like he was in his late 20s and said he'd been camping in the nearby woods and had gotten into a situation. He asked if he could crash at my place just for the night. Based on where my house is, if he was telling the truth, I'd be the nearest place with a roof for at least 5 or 6 miles in any direction. And it was still coming down hard out there, which made me feel a little bad for him. But that didn't make the whole thing any less risky. Letting someone I didn't know into my house in the middle of nowhere just didn't sit right. I offered to let him use my phone to call someone for a ride into town. He refused, saying he'd just try somewhere else. When I told him I wasn't comfortable with him staying here, he didn't argue. He just turned and walked off into the night. I watched him head back down the driveway for a bit before veering off into the trees. As weird as it all felt, I didn't think about it much longer and eventually went back to watching TV. I didn't check the clock much after that, but it must have been at least a couple of hours later, well past dark, when I noticed an orange glow outside one of the back windows. I got up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the foggy glass and heavy rain, I spotted a small fire burning out in the woods behind my place. It was under a big tree, just far enough to be hard to make out. The flame flickered low and steady despite the rain, and standing next to it was the shape of someone, though I couldn't tell whether they were facing my house or looking deeper into the woods. They were holding something, but I couldn't tell what. I slowly let the curtain fall back into place and grabbed my phone. I called the sheriff's office to report the man I'd seen earlier. I told them someone was out behind my property and that I didn't want him hanging around that close to the house. They said they'd send someone, but given how remote my location is, it might take about an hour. He hadn't technically done anything yet, but I didn't want to go to bed with someone lurking around my backyard either. Once I hung up with the dispatcher, I peeked through the window again. The fire was still flickering, but the man wasn't there anymore. That's when I heard footsteps, wet, heavy steps, coming around the side of the house. I ran to the front of the house and looked through a side window. I caught a glimpse of him walking past, holding what looked like a hunting rifle. He disappeared around the corner toward my front porch. Seconds later, he pounded on the front door. I froze. Then it went quiet again. No talking, no more knocking, just silence and the rain. I rushed over to the hall closet and grabbed the small pistol I kept for protection. My ears were ringing with panic, and I ducked behind the wall next to the entryway, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. Suddenly, the guy slammed into the door again. This time it was louder, and I realized he was using the butt of his rifle to hit it. The wood splintered, and part of the panel almost gave in. At that point, I didn't have time to think anymore. I felt like if I didn't act right then, one of us might not make it out of this. So I aimed toward the lower part of the door frame and fired a single shot. The sound was so loud in the small house that I couldn't hear anything for a few seconds. Just the ringing in my ears and the pouring rain outside. When the noise finally cleared, I stood there, frozen, listening. But it was completely silent. No footsteps, no more banging, nothing. After about 5 minutes of dead quiet, I worked up the nerve to look through the peephole. The porch was empty. I opened the door a crack and looked out across the yard. I could see muddy footprints leading away from the house and vanishing into the woods. He must have taken off as soon as he heard the shot, maybe even during the moment I was deaf from the blast. The police arrived later and walked around the property with flashlights. They found some strange stuff near where the campfire had been. There was a duffel bag that looked like it had recently been dug up from a shallow hole nearby. Inside were all sorts of tools, things like bolt cutters, gloves, rope, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The officers said it looked like someone had stashed it there ahead of time, probably planning to come back and use it later. They called it a burglary kit, though they also said it could have been something worse. The idea that this whole thing had been planned beforehand, and that he'd been out near my property at least once before, really messed with my head. To this day, no one knows for sure who he was, what exactly he wanted, or why he came after me specifically. He never got caught, and nothing ever turned up in the investigation beyond that night. I still live in the same house, and not a single day goes by without me wondering if one day he might come back. I'm 32 and live alone in a house out in the countryside. I have a couple of neighbors who live about half a mile down the road. I talk to them now and then, but for the most part, I stick to myself and only drive into town when I absolutely need something. I'm partly retired, so I spend a lot of time at home, although I still take on some contract jobs for part of the year. This happened in late October. On that particular day, I was out in the yard putting away some of my gear, getting things ready for winter. Mostly it was tools, a couple of weed trimmers, a push mower, stuff like that I'd left out. While I was gathering everything, I noticed something strange. A man was walking down the road that runs past the end of my driveway. He wasn't carrying anything. No bag, no backpack, no supplies. Just walking. For context, this road doesn't get much traffic. It's really just a long stretch that connects a few houses like mine. The nearest town is about 4 hours away on foot. I watched him for a while until he eventually disappeared down the road. After he was out of sight, I checked both ways and didn't see any parked cars. There wasn't a single vehicle in either direction. It felt off. But eventually, I shrugged it off and kept working. I was back inside the house before it got too dark. Made myself some food and was cooling off afterward when I suddenly heard a loud knock from outside. It sounded like a wooden bang, almost like it came from the area around the shed. I looked out through the window and saw that the shed door was wide open. That shed's old, sure, but the door had never popped open by itself before. Not sure what was going on, I figured I better check it out and shut the door at the very least. Just in case, I grabbed my hunting rifle. I didn't really think there'd be any danger, but it felt smarter to be safe. When I walked out to the shed, I paused for a moment and listened. It was quiet. Not even the sound of crickets. I scanned the field, looked around. No signs of anyone or anything moving. When I got up to the shed, I turned on my flashlight and aimed it inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing missing or out of place. I stepped in and did a slower check, looking behind shelves and along the corners in case some animal had gotten inside. But there was nothing. After double-checking, I closed the shed door and latched it tight, then turned and started heading back toward the house. As I crossed the yard, something started to feel wrong. I didn't know what exactly, just that tight feeling in your stomach when something isn't right. It got stronger the closer I got to the front door. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me. As I walked through the front hallway, I noticed something strange on the floor. I flicked the lights on and saw a dirty footprint on the tile. There were more, a trail of them, leading all the way to the guest room at the end of the hall. My chest tightened. I raised my rifle, took a slow breath, and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against it and listened. First, it was quiet, but then I heard breathing. It wasn't mine. Someone was on the other side, breathing slow and steady, like they were waiting. Before I could even decide what to do, the doorknob twisted in my hand, and the door flung open. I stumbled back, lifting the rifle just in time. A man stood in the doorway, the same one from the road I could tell from the face. He looked furious. He had a metal shovel raised like a weapon. I think the sight of the rifle made him freeze, because he didn't come at me right away. Just stood there, holding the shovel and glaring at me with pure hate in his eyes. I shouted at him to back off, trying to sound like I had control of the situation. But inside, I was scared stiff. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't lower the shovel either. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. I knew calling the police would take a long time. They'd need at least an hour to get out here, and I couldn't just stand there pointing a rifle at this guy the whole time. Too much could go wrong. Then suddenly, without a word, he flung the shovel toward me. It hit the wall behind me and clattered to the floor. By the time I looked back at him, he was running. He dashed back into the guest room and dove headfirst through the window. I rushed over to try and stop him but froze for a second. He was already halfway through. I saw him drop down and disappear into the dark field behind my house. I stood there watching the dark for a long time. No clue where he'd gone. No way to follow him without risking everything. I never saw him again. No one's ever been able to identify who he was. I never found out what he wanted or why he came to my place that night. The footprints stopped near the edge of the woods and then vanished. All I know is, if I hadn't had that rifle ready or if he had surprised me before I noticed the tracks, I probably wouldn't be alive right now. I was 19 back then, and it was early June. School had just let out for summer, and I didn't have a job at the time, so I was spending most of my days indoors, playing games, watching shows on YouTube or TV, or just laying around. When this happened, my parents were away for a few days on a trip out of state, leaving me at home by myself. That wasn't anything new. They'd done it plenty of times before, and it was never a big deal. Sometimes I'd have a couple friends over, but this particular night, I just felt like being alone. I was watching an older episode of one of my favorite series on Netflix, casually scrolling through stuff on my phone at the same time. It was already late. I'm not totally sure what time it was, but I guess maybe a bit before midnight, when I suddenly heard a knock at the front door. I paused the TV and went to check it out. At first, it didn't even cross my mind that it was such a weird time for someone to come by. But right before I reached for the doorknob, the thought hit me and stopped me in my tracks. I leaned in to check through the peephole and saw two men standing there. They looked kind of alike, both dressed similarly in dark jeans and light-colored jackets, and just standing still, like they were waiting for me to open the door. I stood there for a few seconds trying to decide whether I should let them know I was inside or just stay completely quiet. Eventually, I stayed quiet, hoping they'd just go away. But a moment later, one of them called out, "Hello? We're here to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Holland." That was my parents' last name, though I've changed it here for privacy. I didn't answer. I just stood there, confused, thinking how odd it was for anyone to be dropping by this late, even if it was for something important. After maybe a minute, the two guys looked at each other and said something quietly, then walked off the porch. We didn't have the outside lights on, so I couldn't tell where they went after they left the porch. What really unsettled me was that I never saw headlights or heard a car pull up or drive away. That made me wonder if they'd actually walked here, which felt even more off. I went back to the couch but didn't press play on the show. I kept the room quiet just in case I heard them come back. And sure enough, just a few minutes later, I started to hear footsteps again outside. They stepped onto the porch, but instead of knocking again, the sound moved to the side of the house. I jumped up and rushed to the back of the house, peeking through a window near the kitchen. I saw them walking into the backyard. They had opened the gate and let themselves in. I quickly backed away from the window so they wouldn't spot me. I crouched low and could still hear them. They were speaking softly. Then I heard them start messing with the back door handle, trying to get it open. That's when I realized this was serious. I grabbed my phone and quietly slipped into the garage. From there, I called 911 and told the dispatcher that I thought someone was trying to break into the house. Less than a minute after that, I heard a sharp noise, like a loud pop or something snapping, and then the back door slid open. I froze. I could hear their footsteps coming in. They walked through the house, then went straight to the staircase. I heard them go upstairs. A few seconds later, a door opened and shut, and then silence. I stayed hidden in the garage for what felt like forever, but it was probably around 10 minutes before the cops showed up. The moment I saw the flashing lights through the small garage window, I felt a wave of relief, but I didn't move. Right as they pulled up, I heard quick movements upstairs. The two men were suddenly arguing with each other. The police entered through the back door first. I heard them rushing upstairs, and then one officer came through the garage side door and found me. He helped me outside while the others cleared the house. The two guys didn't try to run or resist, but they also didn't say anything. Not a single word about why they were there. Even after several weeks went by, there were no real answers. The whole thing was clearly more than just a simple burglary, but since nothing was taken, and they didn't do anything physically violent, the only charges that stuck were trespassing and breaking and entering. Still, what really unsettled me was that they'd specifically asked for my parents by name. It honestly felt like they had come there for them, and maybe were planning to wait upstairs until my parents returned. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if I'd made a noise or let them know I was there. Maybe that would have stopped them. But something about their behavior tells me that they were going to come in one way or another. And I can't help but think, if I hadn't stayed hidden, whatever they came there to do, they might have done to me. Back when I was a teenager, I lived with my mom in a small rental house during my junior high and high school years. She worked overnight shifts, so most nights I was alone from around 7:45 p.m. until almost 4:30 in the morning. This happened a few months before I finished high school. It was just a normal evening. Around 7:15, I said goodbye to my mom like I always did. Then I went into the living room and played some games for a few hours. Since it was a school night, I couldn't stay up all night, but I still stayed up later than I should have. Around 11:15, I turned off the TV and game system and went upstairs to get into bed. But I laid there on my phone for another hour or so before I eventually fell asleep. I woke up suddenly because I thought I heard a door close downstairs. I looked over at the alarm clock on my nightstand and saw it was 3:25 a.m. I figured my mom must have come home early from her shift. I rolled over and tried to fall back asleep while listening to what sounded like footsteps moving around downstairs. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I started focusing on the sounds more closely. Usually, when my mom came home, she'd come straight upstairs to get ready for bed. But whoever was down there was just walking around. They weren't stopping in one place. They were moving through each room slowly, like they were checking the house out. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I got the sense that maybe it wasn't my mom after all. I got out of bed and switched on the light in my room. The moment I did that, the footsteps stopped completely. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Everything was silent. I carefully opened the door and looked down the hall. I expected to see some lights on downstairs, but the whole house was completely dark. That scared me more than anything, the idea that someone was moving through the place without turning on a single light. Trying to make as little noise as possible, I stepped down the hallway and stopped at the top of the stairs. I crouched down and looked between the railings to see into the living room. There was no one visible, and even in the dark I could tell nothing had been touched. My gaming system was still sitting there. I figured if someone had broken in to steal stuff and walked all over the house, they definitely would have taken that first. At that point, I just wanted to be sure if my mom was actually home, or if I was losing it and hearing things. I went down the stairs and stood in the entryway. I called out, "Mom, are you home?" but didn't get any reply. The house stayed completely still. I walked into the hallway and headed toward the kitchen. Right away, I noticed a single muddy shoe print on the tile. I looked up, and across the kitchen, I locked eyes with someone. There was a man sitting at our dining table. He had a dark ski mask on and wore black clothing, making it hard to see any details. He didn't say a word or even move. He just stared straight at me with a blank expression. I turned around and bolted back up the stairs, locked my bedroom door, and called 911 as fast as I could. I whispered frantically to the operator, who kept me updated on when officers would arrive. While I was on the phone, I heard the floor creaking as the man began walking again. He slowly made his way across the downstairs and toward the bottom of the staircase. I stayed as quiet as I could, heart pounding, until I heard the front door creak open, and then I heard him walk out. Not even half a minute later, headlights flashed through my window. My mom pulled into the driveway, and I rushed outside to meet her and tell her what had just happened. The police showed up shortly after. They searched every inch of the place but couldn't find anything that would help track the guy down. He hadn't taken anything, and there were no signs he tried to break open any doors or windows. What really chilled me later was thinking about how he hadn't come to steal. He didn't show any interest in me either. The way he waited quietly in the dark made me think he was planning something far worse. Maybe he was watching for my mom and expected her to be home around that time. It seemed like he had broken in just minutes before she normally got back. It's hard not to wonder what could have happened if I hadn't gone downstairs, or if she had arrived just a little earlier and walked into the house with no idea that someone was already inside, waiting. I came across your channel a few weeks ago, and I saw that you accept submissions, so here's the scariest true story I know. This one happened 6 years ago, almost to the exact day. My best friend's dad went camping in the Northwest Territories of Canada to a place called Roof Lake. To anyone unfamiliar with the area, it might not sound like a big deal, but if you knew my friend's dad, you'd understand how out of character it was for him. He left for the trip in September, saying he'd be back in a couple of weeks. He hadn't been camping since he was a kid, but the strange thing was that he hated the outdoors. He was more of an indoor guy into gadgets and electronics. Then suddenly, he takes an interest in camping, buys a bunch of gear, and just announces one day that he's heading out. Another odd thing is that he took the family's 2 dogs with him. This was especially strange because he hated those dogs. The only reason they even had them was because his wife and kids begged him for years. He wouldn't walk them, pick up after them, or do anything for them. He didn't even want to be in the same room as them. But suddenly, he decided they deserved an adventure. It was completely out of character for him. My friend's family started to wonder if he was having a midlife crisis, but there wasn't much they could do other than let him go and figure it out. But then, he didn't come back when he said he would. In fact, he never returned at all. After waiting longer than expected, my friend's family reported him missing. The police said they'd send a search team to look around Roof Lake for signs of him, but weeks turned into months with no trace of him. No one wanted to believe he was dead, especially my friend and his family. By the end of March, he'd been missing for over 5 months, and people started losing hope. The weather didn't help either. No one thought he could survive the winter up there, especially without any camping experience. Then, in early April, a pilot flying over the area spotted a man and what looked like 2 dogs near Roof Lake. The pilot reported it, even though he wasn't part of an official search team. He must have known about my friend's dad going missing. Soon, a proper search team was sent out, and within a day, they found his campsite. They found wooden tent poles on the ground, some boat wax, a tent, and dog supplies. But my friend's dad was nowhere to be found. The boat wax was strange because it suggested he had some kind of canoe with him. My friend's dad had never shown any interest in canoes, and there was no sign that he'd bought one before he left for the trip. After another round of searching, the police told my friend's family they thought he might be in Yellowknife, the largest town in the area. They searched all around Roof Lake and found nothing else, so they expanded the search to Yellowknife. Later, they moved the search to Prince George because my friend's dad had an old college friend who lived there, and they thought maybe he'd stopped by. But there was no sign of him, and unless the friend in Yellowknife was hiding something, he confirmed that my friend's dad never visited him. So where did he go? What happened to him? It's hard to say it out loud, but most people assume he's probably no longer alive. He went from resenting the dogs to suddenly becoming interested in camping and canoeing. Unless he'd secretly become a survival expert, which is possible, it seems likely that he got in over his head and didn't realize it until it was too late. One thing the authorities told my friend's family was that even in summer, the rivers and lakes in that region stay freezing cold all year long. Even though April might seem like a nice time for a trip downstream, falling into that water could be deadly if there's no one around to help. They also said wild animals could have gotten to him, and if that was the case, there wouldn't be much left of him except his belongings. But the thing that doesn't add up is the canoe. A bear might eat a person, but it wouldn't eat a whole canoe, and a colorful canoe should be easy to spot. The authorities have been looking for him for years now, and while they usually find some evidence within a few months, they've never found anything from my friend's dad after they discovered his campsite. I've heard people suggest that fresh snow could have covered the canoe, making it harder to find him. But it's been over 5 years now, not counting 2020 when everything was scaled back because of the pandemic. I just don't understand how, after all this time, there's still no sign of him. Search and rescue teams usually find some kind of trace. Bones, clothing, equipment, but they haven't found a single thing. People have speculated that if the canoe was covered by snow, it might take a long time for it to be found. But it's starting to feel like my friend's dad simply vanished without a trace. And if I find it haunting, I can't even imagine how my friend and his family feel. They try to stay strong, but I know they're hurting and would do anything for some final, definitive answers. Three years ago, I relocated to a new city a few states away on the East Coast for a job opportunity. Due to financial constraints, I couldn't visit the area before making the move. However, since I was only renting, the risk felt minimal. It was mid-September when the movers arrived, packed up my things, and delivered them to the house. The landlord kindly allowed them to unload for me since I wouldn't be arriving until the following week. When I finally showed up on a Monday evening, it was my first time seeing the house. It was in disarray, with boxes scattered everywhere and furniture haphazardly placed. The house itself was decent, though. The layout was a bit unusual, as it was a one-story house with the kitchen and living room on one side and a long hallway leading to the bedrooms and bathrooms on the other. Since it was late, I decided to start setting up the bed in the master bedroom. After that, I turned off the lights and went to sleep. I didn't have a clock set up, so I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I thought it might just be the house settling, but I wanted to check it out in case it was something I needed to report to the landlord. I got up, walked to the door, and as I got closer, I realized the sound was coming from down the hallway. I opened the door, and the noise immediately stopped. The hallway was completely dark, so I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. I slowly walked down the hall and peeked into the living room. It looked the same as it had earlier, so I switched on the lights and checked around. On the floor, there were a lot of footprints scattered across the boxes, which I assumed came from the movers. There were no other signs of anything unusual, so I returned to the bedroom. It took a while for me to fall back asleep because I couldn't stop thinking about how the noise stopped as soon as I opened the door. I kept trying to think of a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. When I finally drifted back to sleep, it felt like I barely stayed asleep before a loud thud, and the sound of footsteps running down the hallway woke me up. My eyes snapped open, and I looked at the bedroom door. It was wide open, and there were clear footprints on the floor leading right up to my bed. I jumped up, quickly running to check, but by the time I reached the hallway, there was no one there. All that was left were scuffed footprints where someone had evidently run off. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom while I waited. When they arrived, they couldn't find any signs of a break-in except for the footprints. I tried to convince myself that whoever had been in the house must have gotten in during the week before I arrived, but something didn't sit right. After I unpacked and checked all the boxes, nothing seemed to be missing. It made me wonder what they were doing in the house. But the biggest mystery was why they had walked up to my bed and what caused the thud I had heard right before they ran off. The landlord quickly offered to let me break the lease and move out, as long as I kept quiet about the break-in. At the time, I thought he was just concerned about scaring off future renters, not wanting to lose out on income. But now I'm not so sure. For the last several years, I've been juggling 2 jobs, usually leaving my place around 5:45 each morning and not getting back until almost 10:30 at night. I sleep, wake up, and do the same thing again. That's just how life has been lately. This all happened not too long ago, maybe a few months back. I'd gotten home one night and followed my usual routine, which was taking a quick shower and getting ready to crash for the night. While I was in the shower, I suddenly heard what sounded like movement right outside the bathroom door. I got out fast and checked the hallway. Nothing. So I figured it must have just been the house settling or something normal like that. I finished getting cleaned up, then got into bed. All night, I kept hearing weird noises coming from different parts of the house. Mostly just soft creaking, kind of like the sound of a strong wind pushing against the house, except there wasn't any wind at all. There was no reason for the place to be making those kinds of sounds. At one point in the middle of the night, I even got up and walked around trying to figure out what it was. I didn't see anything out of place. That next morning, I was completely drained. I worked a full day, barely staying awake with the help of way too much coffee. By the time I got home, I was beyond tired and just wanted one decent night of rest. I went straight upstairs and started running the water for a shower. Before I even stepped in, I heard something again, right outside the bathroom door. This time, I was certain it was real. It sounded like someone walking past the door and heading out of the room. As ridiculous as it seemed, it truly sounded like something had crossed through my bedroom. I stood there for a while, nerves building up. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, I found nothing. I walked through the house again and peeked into every room, but saw no one. I told myself maybe it was the pipes or something moving in the walls or under the floors. I tried to convince myself of that, even though it didn't feel right. I showered, got in bed, and eventually fell asleep not long before midnight. The moment I woke up, I felt it. Something was off. It was pitch black, clearly still the middle of the night, and the house was dead silent. I didn't know what had woken me, but it felt connected to the strange noises I'd been hearing. I looked toward the door and noticed the faintest shift of a shadow under the crack. I jumped up and stared, heart pounding, as I watched the shape move away from the door. Then I heard slow, heavy steps moving down the upstairs hallway. I froze, completely terrified, but the fear mixed with panic must have kicked my body into motion. I leapt out of bed and yanked the door open. At the far end of the hall stood a dark silhouette of a person. The only clear thing I could make out were his eyes, sharp and full of tension, almost like he was angry but also restless. I slammed my door shut and locked it. I could hear his steps heading down the stairs right away. It took about half a minute before I finally heard the sound of the front door open and close. I called the police as fast as I could. They got there quickly, but there wasn't much they could do. They found a few subtle signs that someone had been living inside the house, probably for a few days, but that was all they found. To this day, I have no idea where he'd been hiding. I keep thinking about those times I'd hear someone walking past the bathroom door. Was he sleeping in my bed and then sneaking into the closet when I got home? Maybe he waited until I turned the shower on before slipping out of the room unnoticed. What haunts me the most is wondering why he stayed downstairs for a little while after I saw him. He had to know I was calling for help. Why didn't he just leave right away? There are too many questions I'll never get answers to. But knowing that a complete stranger had been staying inside my house, moving around at night while I slept, is something I'll never forget. As far as I know, he's never come back, and no one's heard anything new since. I've always had a connection to nature, and my friend Jack was just the same. We'd been inseparable since childhood, back when we used to skip school and play around in the ravines near our neighborhood in Winnipeg. Over time, this turned into an annual tradition. Each summer, we'd pick a location, pack light, and set out for a weekend of camping. Eventually, we found that we had to take things to the next level to get that same old thrill. We coined the term extreme camping, which I'm sure wasn't a new idea, but it described what we did. No tents, no stoves, just tarps, sleeping bags, and whatever we could carry in our packs. We'd bring some food, but it was minimal, just enough to last for a day or two before we had to rely on foraging and fishing to survive. It wasn't easy, but that's exactly what we were after. When we turned 24, we decided on a 7-day trip to Riding Mountain National Park, a vast expanse of forest and lakes in Manitoba. It was perfect for our kind of adventure. We began strong on the first day, hiking 12 miles from the trailhead, pushing through dense thickets of pine and birch. The air was crisp, and the sky had scattered clouds. After our hike, we set up camp near a shallow creek. I rigged my tarp over a low branch, while Jack gathered firewood. We ate some jerky, boiled water from the creek, and let the campfire burn down as the stars emerged in the night sky. It was peaceful, just the sounds of rustling leaves and an occasional owl in the distance. No noise, no distractions, just the wilderness. Day 2 was tougher. The terrain grew more challenging with rocks and roots underfoot. We had to climb a steep ridge to continue north. By midday, my legs were sore, and Jack, who was taller, was pulling ahead with his long strides. That night, we slept on a patch of moss. The ground was cold, and at one point, I woke up to the snap of a twig. I grabbed for the knife I kept at my side, but it turned out to be just a deer moving through the forest. By day 3, we had settled into a rhythm. Our packs were lighter now, and our food was running low, but hunger had always been a great motivator for me. In the afternoon, Jack caught a small trout from a stream using a line he had made, and we cooked it over the fire. The fresh fish and water from the stream tasted better than any bottled water we could have bought. We didn't follow the map much anymore, just let our instincts guide us through the wilderness. Riding Mountain was vast, and we were deep in the forest, far from any roads or ranger stations. That's exactly why we were there, no safety nets, just us and the wild. The 4th day started like the rest. Jack was already awake, packing up his gear as I climbed out of my tent. We ate the last of our granola, shouldered our packs, and continued north. The forest was dense, and we didn't speak much. Our footsteps were the only sound we could hear. Around noon, we stopped at a narrow stream to refill our water bottles. I knelt by the water, splashing some on my face when Jack tapped my shoulder. "Do you see that?" he asked. I followed his gaze, and at first I didn't see what he was pointing at, but then I did. A shape in the distance, too many straight lines to be natural. We quickly grabbed our packs and moved closer, pushing through the underbrush. As the trees started to thin, we saw it. A building. More specifically, a church. The walls were made of old, weathered wood, cracked and gray, as though it had been there for 100 years. The steep roof was covered in moss and fallen needles, and a rusted cross sat on top. Another cross hung from the boarded-up door, which was secured with chains and a heavy padlock. There were no steeples, no windows, just this decaying structure, swallowed by the forest. I turned to Jack, muttering something like, "What in the world?" He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out the map, spread it on the ground, and began tracing our route with his finger. There was nothing on the map where the church should have been. No markings, no signs, just an empty space for miles in every direction. It felt odd. This church with no paths leading to it, far from any homes or settlements. Jack folded the map and stared at the building, his eyes fixed on it. "We should check it out," he said. We circled the structure, stepping over roots and ducking under branches. The boarded-up door caught my attention. The rust was thick, and the lock seemed untouched. It looked like no one had been there in ages. As we rounded the side, we saw a hole in the wall where the rotting wood had been scraped away. It was low and jagged, just big enough for a person to crawl through. "Must be an animal," Jack said, peering through the hole. "Probably a den." He was probably right, but when he dropped his pack and started crawling through the gap, I began to feel uneasy. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You want to go inside?" "Of course. Don't you want to see what's in there?" he replied. I suggested shining a flashlight through the hole instead of going inside, but Jack ignored me. He just wriggled through the opening, and of course I followed. The air inside the church was damp, cold, and musty. We stood up in the dim light, brushing dirt off our pants. The place was completely empty. No pews, just bare walls and a floor covered in dry leaves. At the far end, a large wooden cross stood. But what really caught my attention was the steel trapdoor in the center of the room. It was partially covered in dirt, its edges bolted down and wrapped in thick chains. A rusted padlock hung from the links, sealing it shut. I stepped closer, staring at the trapdoor. It looked solid, no marks or scratches, just cold, dirty metal. Jack walked over and knelt beside it. The chains rattled as he tugged at them. They were solid, unyielding. I asked out loud what could possibly need to be locked up like that. Jack looked up. Maybe it's not a church anymore. Maybe it's a hideout now. That much was obvious. But for what? And for whom? Jack stood up, wiping his hands. Could be anything. Cash, a smuggler's stash, or loot from a robbery. I wasn't so sure. A stash of cash seemed unlikely, And it could just as easily be something dangerous, nuclear waste or chemicals, something people didn't want to be found. I thought I made a good point, but Jack wasn't hearing it. His eyes had a certain edge to them, like he'd already made up his mind. "We've got to get in there," he said, heading for the hole in the wall. "Let's find something to break the chains." I yelled for him to wait, grabbing his arm, but he pulled free and crawled out anyway. I had no choice but to follow. Outside, Jack started pacing, kicking at the ground. I asked what he was doing, though I already knew. "I'm looking for a rock," he said. "Something heavy enough to smash that lock." But the forest floor was flat, covered in needles and small stones. Nothing big enough for what he needed. I told him he was acting reckless. Even if there was something down there, it was a terrible idea to try to get it. If it was cash or jewels, it could belong to dangerous people, and taking it would be like signing our own death warrants. Jack ignored me, like he hadn't heard a word I said. "I'll find something," he shouted, striding off into the trees. "I don't care how long it takes." That's when I snapped. I ran after him, grabbed his shoulder, and spun him around. I demanded to know what had gotten into him. He shoved me back and we started wrestling. He was taller but much thinner, and it was tough, but I managed to shove him against a tree before things got worse. "Stop! Just stop!" I yelled. Suddenly, it was like he could hear me again. He froze, let go of me, and I stumbled back. We both stood there, breathing heavily, and I asked again what had gotten into him. His face was pale, slick with sweat. He said he didn't know, and when I pressed him, he said he couldn't stop thinking about the trapdoor, what might be down there. He said it felt like he needed to know. It was the adventure he had been searching for. I crouched beside him, feeling the adrenaline fade. I asked if he was good to keep going, and he nodded. We gathered our packs and moved on, leaving the strange church behind. The rest of the trip felt off. We camped for 2 more nights, stuck to our usual routine of hiking, foraging, and boiling water, but the excitement had faded. I kept watching Jack, waiting for that odd energy to return, but thankfully, it didn't. He was quieter but back to normal. When we finally hiked out and drove back to Winnipeg, he was cracking jokes again, like nothing strange had happened. We started calling the church the Stash House, turning it into a joke we'd laugh about over beers. But whenever I thought about it alone,